So today's of course event is Naiza Khan's Artist Talk Objects from the Deep, and she is so she received her BFA from Oxford from the Ruskin School, and since graduating she's been very active as an artist, and is was based in Karachi for actually almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
2 decades, yeah, and has had a very active practice and has won a number of important awards, including the 2013 Prince Claus Award for Culture and Development given by the Netherlands Fine Arts Award. In terms of her exhibitions, she's had numerous exhibitions. The resume is very long, okay, but just last year she was a participant in the Kochi Museums Biennial in Kochi, as well as the Colombo Biennial in Sri Lanka, along with many other shows. Okay, so I leave the resume out for people who want to see. Okay, but Naiza is much more than an artist. Of course, her artwork is very central to her kind of in a sense what she does, but she's also been somebody who's been very generous in developing the art scene in Pakistan especially. So she's been an advisor, she's been a prominent teacher and faculty, and has taught in a number of art schools. Most recently she's been associated with the Karachi University Visual Art Department, and she's also serving as advisor to the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture. Naiza has also curated this very important exhibition, which is called The Rising Tide, and this was a groundbreaking exhibition of new directions in art from Pakistan in over 2 decades. And before this there was no exhibition which summed up the contemporary art of Pakistan in Pakistan itself. Okay, okay. Apart from that, these are also some monographs on her own artwork, which I'll pass around so people can have a look at. So I mean, I've known Naiza since the early 1990s, okay? And in fact we were living about a block away, okay, for about a decade. So this is, so when I was in Karachi, then we had, in a sense, we were very, in a sense, we were all, a small number of contemporary artists who were kind of, living there and thinking about things and showing together. So it's really a pleasure for me to welcome Naiza to my home now in Cornell. Thank you.
I'm feeling very nostalgic now. Thank you very much, Iftikhar, and I'd just like to thank the ICM, to Professor Salah Hassan, to Professor Iftikhar Dadi for this opportunity to be here. And I think as a visual artist, there's nothing like having time away from the daily life and the routine of life, so that you can really isolate yourself a little bit and work and think through ideas. I can't really describe what this space means to me as a visual artist, but it's a very valuable time of thinking space. And I've put down a sort of chart of targets or research plans and things I want to do here. I hope I can do a few of the numerous things that I would like to in this short time. But thank you very much for this opportunity. It really means a lot to me. Thinking about Karachi in the early 90s is a very interesting time, because it's a time which is now being evaluated and historicized. And of course, Iftikhar and a number of other artists were part of the sort of early scene of what was changing and what was emerging in Karachi. And when I moved in 1990, I was quite young, and there was a number of artists with very mature practices. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I was producing during the early 90s. And I think it's also been really good to put this talk together, because I've been thinking about that time in a specific way, with a certain amount of retrospection to what I was doing at that time, and also to what people are talking about in terms of what that time means in the sort of historical sort of moment of development in art in that region. So I'm going to maybe ask you to just switch off one set of lights if it's okay. I'm told some people might fall asleep, but I don't mind. You know, you can take a small nap as long as you wake up.
I'm going to keep these on for the video camera.
Yeah, sure.
But I don't know if I can get these off.
No, it's okay.
That one's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Karachi in the early 90s has been written a lot about, especially by Dr. Iftikhar Dadi. But, you know, for me as an artist, I came to the city from London with very much a figurative practice. And so a lot of my work continued exploring the body, exploring the female form within my studio space. And it was very drawing centric, so drawing was a core activity and it supported a lot of the conceptual sort of investigation that I was taking on. But after a lot of time, I think after sort of 2 decades, you start to think about you know, what did this work really mean in the context of being in Karachi, being in a city which has sort of over 21 million people, a post-colonial city which has a history of a lot of strife and ethnic, you know, diversity. And I think I was talking about the work recently, and the idea of the body through the city and the city through the body came out as a sort of, I suppose, a phrase to think about. And I found that really interesting because most of my practice for almost you know, the first 15 years was very much based within my studio. It was very much based around the figure, looking at ideas of gender, looking at ideas of personal issues. But at the same time, the city was something that was constantly rolling as a parallel sort of, you know, it was sort of rolling on its own meter. And I think that I absorbed a lot of things. You know, you couldn't not absorb because politics and life in a city in South Asia is just, it drums into every pore of your being. So however much you try to sort of pull yourself into a space of concentration and solitude or work, it's always something that, you know, you're absorbing whether you like it or not. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I'm looking at these drawings now with a sense of trying to understand what does it mean to think about the city through the body in these works. And maybe somebody else has to write a bit more about that because I'm really just talking through it and thinking through it as I show you these images. Most of these images were made with my model, who I've worked with for about 20 years. Not easy to find a model who will pose in the nude in Pakistan. I mean, I've taught drawing for many years. At art college, we don't have nude models, but you know, clothed models. But for me, in my studio, I was able to find somebody who I could, you know, intellectually bridge that kind of gap of, look, working with an artist is like working with a medical doctor, and you know, looking at anatomy is part of my practice, part of my thinking. And so, you know, I was able to intellectualize that process and work with somebody who's really stayed in my studio and my practice and as a friend for a very long time. So, you know, I think about the subjective effects of urbanization because Karachi has been one of the fastest growing cities, you know, in the world. When you look at Bombay or Tokyo, you can look at Karachi in the same way. And I think also, I think a lot about this sort of idea of reinforcing my reliance on the body as an archive to sort of look at certain spaces and certain narratives. You know, some of these narratives are very personal, and some of them are also, in a sense, you know, they meet the social space at a certain tangent. They meet the space of the city at certain points. So this figurative practice really extends from about 1990, which is when I moved to Pakistan, till almost 2008. And so I'm going to just really move through some of these early images, which kind of talk about the idea of the performing body, but also as a sort of the body as a repository of memory. You know, many of these drawings have became very large scale, and Heavenly Ornaments was really a body of work, and this is one of the kind of drawings that began the process of thinking about not just the body but attire and things that are carried on the body, and how garments sort of talk about certain kinds of ideas to do with personal subjectivity and ideas of sexuality. So the title comes from a book called Behishti Zeba, which is a text written by a Muslim scholar in the early 20th century, in which he was trying to educate women in India at that time, and looking at the Muslim women particularly, because he felt that Muslim women should be as educated as Muslim men, as educated as anybody in society, and so this sort of book was written to educate women. Barbara Metcalf does a fantastic rereading of this book, but also I think for a 21st century sort of female feminist, you would find it, the original book, really quite prescriptive and kind of quite patronizing. But nonetheless, the work that the sort of what I got out of the book was the sense of just understanding a certain kind of patriarchy at a particular time, which seemed to have filtered through society even at the time that I lived in Pakistan. So a number of drawings again, I'm just really moving through this work so you can see the images and perhaps ask any questions perhaps later on. So this idea of attire was kind of becoming quite important, and at some point I realized that I was making some images which had a sense of deja vu. And I think the first image was the one on the left, which is actually called Henrique's Row, and it's after Rembrandt's painting of Henrique bathing in the river, which Rembrandt did sort of around the mid-17th century. I didn't realize, I had a training at art college in a lot of European art, a lot of classicism, a lot of drawing, printmaking. So I guess, this repertoire of work was part of my sensibility or understanding of, art history. And so these references were not unusual for me sitting in Karachi, even though, I was there, I could still think about these things as something that I, as an artist, would access. So these images kind of, again, touch upon ideas of, female sensibility, Rembrandt's sort of non-idealized kind of ideas of how the body was represented, and at the time that he worked, I suppose, broke away from certain kinds of notions of idealism. But for me, I think I was looking at the sort of narratives that he was using and the allegory of his it's working between religious iconography and everyday, sort of how a woman would feel about something. And so these ideas of Bathsheba reading a letter, or Susanna and the Elders, which are all biblical narratives really, were used, but used in a very everyday sense. So on one level I was interested in that, but on another level I was interested in the themes that he was using in a very personal way. Susanna and the Elders, the title of this work is "And They Began to Desire Her," is a line from the story of Susanna from the Bible. And probably most of you know what the story is, I won't go into it. So the images were not representations of the story or illustrations, they were really kind of quite large-scale works which kind of were very personal narratives for myself. And I guess I talk about Rembrandt because it was important for me to see what he was also doing, and looking at kind of ideas or ideals of female heroism across different sort of comparative spaces of art history. More drawings, and at this point I suppose the model was wearing the attire, so I was not really drawing her body, but I was drawing the volume of the negligee or the lingerie that she was wearing. And so these drawings become very much like objects floating in a space, and you have that sense of volume and the body inside in it. not so easy to see because these are large sort of linear ink drawings. Charcoal and Conte on paper, and just again working a lot with drawing through this period of time as a way to really extend ideas. So the drawing started feeling more like objects, as you can see in this last one. It really, I mean, I started experimenting with latex, doing body casts from my model, and then trying to experiment with thinking about how these could become three-dimensional sculptures or objects. But really, after a lot of, trial and error, and I started working with a welder. And so with him I started working on these sort of strip corsets, which were this single metal, almost linear drawings of corsets, and pieces of lingerie that I had. So, I was looking, measuring, going out, sort of working with him, hoping he wouldn't recognize the objects I was making. I mean, all of this, the negotiation of space, working with the welder who's working on gates and window grills, and he's suddenly working on these objects to do with the body. I thought he would freak out and just disappear, but luckily, it's been about 10 years and we're still working together, which is fantastic. He doesn't ask me any questions. I cannot volunteer any answers. But the funny thing is, so I mean, at this point, I'll tell you the funny thing later when you're falling asleep. At this point, I was also working a lot with, the time of experimenting. So working with tarpaulin and bowling, and so some of these pieces, have become are stored in my studio, but they were part of that process. The chastity belt comes in at some point. I think there are always kind of triggers in the work, and one of the triggers that was interesting was in '95, looking at these implements of torture in the Doge Palace Museum in Venice, and in that cupboard full of torture instruments, there were these chastity belts. And I was shocked because I never knew that there was such a thing, and I really didn't. And I just sort of started doing some research and thinking about what was going on when they were made, the social sort of space of Europe around the Crusades perhaps, when these bells started being made, and so this image comes out of a bit of research at the British Library, but really that trigger was seeing these implements of torture. And I started thinking about how the historical text of the Muslim scholar Beheshti Zevar, and these ideas of the female virtue and just the burden that women carry in society, and how all of these things kind of work together. So I started, I made the first chastity belt in 2007, and I guess this was something which was quite interesting to make, because instead of a lock I put a zip in the chastity belt, and so these objects sort of started moving, and it was really because I had was working with the welder that I could actually start to conceptualize and think about other objects that I could construct. And so these objects, these pieces of attire, these armor pieces, really I found that in retrospect, looking at a number of them, they sort of found a place between love and war. They were kind of sensuous, and there was a sexuality in the object, and yet at the same time there was a sense of aggression, of recalcitrance to the social space perhaps. And again, I think I would constantly keep on the side this marker of the city and the social and political strife of the city and the country, I suppose. I mean, there's again, the politics of our space in South Asia just impacts us every single day. And although you're working as an artist in your studio, there's this kind of constant drum beat of of ideas and the impact that it has on you. It comes at a tangent all the time. I think also this sense of the object and the idea of seduction was really important. That was something I was thinking about. I was also thinking about the idea of multiple personas through these objects, that you could be, as a woman, many different things, not just one thing, one identity, one self. And that ideas of the self were often quite unstable and constantly shifting. I think at this time I was also looking at the idea of contradiction and the idea of desire, and also looking at ideas of heroism again. So this particular work comes out of the Rani of Jhansi, who was a warrior queen in the mutiny against the British in 1857 in India. And so she sort of, as history sort of recounts, she charged into battle, died, defending her state against the sort of colonizing British armies. I was also looking a lot at the history of garments. I was looking at fashion and contemporary fashion, designers like Alexander Mcqueen, Martin Margiela, Victor and Rolf. And I mean, these were interesting people because, again, they were, apart from what they perhaps did on the catwalk in terms of their own ideas of contemporary, design and thinking about the body, they were really, experimenting with ideas of duality and image of the body as it was shifting. At the same time, I mean, drawing has, as I said, always been a core part of my practice. So I think at this point also there was a lot of dialogue between the objects and the drawings, and multiple drawings such as these emerged across this space of 2 years when these armor works were, and I was working on them. And they really sort of push the conceptual development of the ideas back and forth. So sometimes I would make an object and I would draw it, but it would extend into something else. Or again, this idea of imagining new pieces which would create multiple identities. These are just some of the drawings from my sketchbooks at that time, which talk about many of the pieces that weren't realized. But I guess this is the exciting part, that when you're kind of constantly thinking through things, the things that emerge, are quite. It's quite exciting to see where they're coming from and what were the spin-offs at that time. In other 2 or 3 pieces which I'll share with you. The spine was again steel, galvanized steel, and it was stitched with suede leather. And this piece was quite directly inspired by a choli garment from which is worn by women in the subcontinent still. But at that time, again, I was looking at maybe early Mughal miniatures and looking at attire, so things like this garment, which was a 2-part piece, which kind of held the body together, the torso, and revealed everything but didn't reveal anything. It would cover one piece would cover the front, and one piece, and it was backless, and the other piece would wrap around the back and be open in the front. So it was a very interesting construction of the object and the garment. So I was fascinated by these sort of these living, worn pieces, which were kind of like skin, but also like shields in a sense. I think there's a kind of defense and there's a kind of defiance in these works. I think also there's a sense of wanting to create an approach towards the body that resists boundaries and contests ownership. The funny thing I was going to tell you was the welder recently was working on something, And you know, I found himself, when I would work with him, I would go inside my house and measure my waist or something, you know, just to get the dimensions of the steel object, because it was very difficult to remake these things. And recently I found him sort of standing in the sculpture courtyard measuring himself as he was making the Chastity Belt. So I was thinking, this is too much. I don't want to go down there. So anyway, moving on. You know, these armor works were really exciting, and there were so many which are left undone. And I think also the process of working on these was really exciting, because I mean, I had, you know, for those 2-3 years, I had a welder, a tailor, and a shoemaker working with me simultaneously on these works, which was really exciting, and they were all men, of course. So the shoemaker would be stitching the leather, the tailor would be making some soft sculpture that I was working on, and the welder. And all of these things would often come together in a piece. So I started thinking about the idea of performance and gesture, and particularly with the soft sculpture. And so a lot of these armor pieces started, I started fabricating them as soft sculptures as well, because I really felt myself caged in by the objects I was making. And so I wanted to kind of, you know, let the objects breathe, and let them interact with the body in some sort of performative way. So these images and the ones I showed you early on were, it was really a photographic sort of project with an art student of mine who's an artist now and a friend. And I think the interesting thing in this time that we photographed the work was the conversation we had, because she actually wore the hijab, she didn't put it on for this, and that was her identity. And so I was particularly talking to her through the process of, you know, her holding the works on top of her body, and the conversation we had was really interesting and worth recording, about the nature of the objects and the idea of the skin and the kind of the nude body, and her carrying the body on her body, and you know what that meant to her. So I think the performance happened there and then. The work in 2008 sort of shifted quite a lot, and I'll talk about that in the next project. But I like this image a lot because I think it gives me a sense of, it implicates a kind of personal cartography onto the city. And it sets into motion a kind of complex relationship between the very personalized subjective bodies onto a terrain that's spinning on its own sort of rhythm. And again, I think the idea of enacting the city through the body in a bodily way was something that subconsciously I was constantly thinking about. I'll just step back a few years, because this whole period of time from 1990 till about 2008 was, you know, an immense amount of work through drawing, and it sort of accumulated, and then the armor works sort of emerged out of that drawing process. But in the middle, somewhere around 2002, I worked on something called Henna Hands, which was really a project outside my studio space. And it was a project, it wasn't really a project for anyone, it was really my attempt to put the body out in the city and to think about, you know, what is going to happen if the female nude becomes part of the landscape of the urban space, and what happens to the politics of the body when it's suddenly placed in this public space. So I would say that it was interesting because, again, moving out of my very sort of sheltered space of the studio into the public space was something that I hadn't negotiated. So Henna Hands, as this body of work is called, is built up of henna pigment, which is applied directly to the walls through smaller stencils. So I build up the bigger stencils through my work with my model in the studio, so they become life-size stencils, and then within them I use smaller hand stencils. And then henna pigment or mehndi is used, as the material. And as you know, henna pigment or mehndi is sort of part of rites and traditions, and it has qualities of healing, purifying, and it's also a cooling agent, and it's also used to decorate the hands of a bride before her marriage in South Asia and many other cultures. So these are sort of more detailed images of what the work actually looked like when it was done on the wall. So I went out to different parts of the city, near the railway station, parts of the city where, buildings were being demolished. And I realized after I'd worked in some of the places that they were very multi-ethnic. So there was a Hindu community, there was a Christian community, there was a Parsi community in that area, in that residential area that I worked. I didn't realize this before I went into it. It was just an area that I was familiar with, and I thought that looks like a nice wall, let me go and do something on it. So that's how it kind of started. But as you work through things, you realize the kind of context that you're working in a little more. And I also really felt like the scale of these bodies, the fact that they were life-size was really important. So people walking on the street could have could confront them and could have a different kind of relationship to them. And also, there were a lot of associations to the work that came through the smell of the henna and kind of personal history. So perhaps it would be useful to tell you that, in the public space in Karachi, one of the things that you see when you walk on the street are wall chalkings, wall graffiti. And this is not graffiti like you would see in Berlin or other cities in Europe. These are political, announcements, political wall chalkings from one extreme of politics to the other extreme of politics. And it's very interesting. I mean, a lot has been written about it. Photographers have done fantastic work on, creating fantastic bodies of work around this this phenomena, because the wall chalkings kind of appear and then they disappear, and they appear and then they disappear with the waves of the political conditions of the city. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that's been written about just the Persian text, the text and the design of the text, and how one political party uses a particular kind of text and so on. So I mean the streets are really ridden with political kind of, it's almost like battles, the conversations that the text has, you find the ideologies of different ethnic communities are kind of really, really loggerheads, and you can feel that pulsating on the walls. So in this case, I did one of the stencils, Henna Hands, on this side, and the left side was a call for a march, by a student wing of an Islamic party after 9/11. So again, the politics and global politics that play out on the streets is something that you feel, and it's an expression of people who perhaps don't feel they can express themselves through other means. So I decided to do a march of women, and these were the women I did alongside as my own personal march. And I think I would probably sort of move on, because there are other things to talk about. And I think what was interesting again was the way that the work sometimes was kept on the walls and sometimes it was erased and scratched away. So you had, it was really a response by very non-art audiences that informed, what they would inform me about the impact of the work in the space, which was really important to me because I didn't want to place this work in a gallery space. I think around 2007 or 8, I went for a walk. And I think walking has been a really important part of my journey at this point, because it has sort of led me to encounter the public space and the terrain of the city and the surroundings of Karachi in a very sort of personal way. And I think it's only when you physically experience a space that you are able to sort of draw out certain kinds of ideas about that space. And so this body of work, which is called Restore the Boundaries, the Menorah Project, spans the last 10 years. And the first part of this title, Restore the Boundaries, I feel it refers to the city of Karachi, about which I think I was trying to find ways to articulate both personal as well as collective experience, a certain kind of mapping. And so the Menorah Project as a whole became a way of reflecting on the notions of boundaries and the demarcation of space, and how social and political ideas impact that demarcation of space. So although these works are rooted in a very specific locale, I think they also resonate with the way I now think about spatiality in South Asia and in the city of Karachi, and also in the way that history and faith interact in a very material and lived sort of way. So I'll show you some images of the work that I produced at this time, but I think one of the things that I keep coming back to when I talk about Menorah is really modes of working and research, which for me as an artist kind of completely changed. Working in my studio, there are certain ways of working, and you sort of recognize those ways. They become habits, and they become something like your instinct. Whereas when you're out in a space where you don't really know what's going to happen, or how do you collate or collect or research or understand things through things that you're seeing. So I think modes of research and how this sort of changed my way of working is a very important part of what I'd like to talk about. And especially mapping as a way to reclaim space as a woman in that context. That was also very important for me. Please tell me how much time I have, because I know I have to stop soon.
It's 5:30 now, so maybe another 15 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I mean the journey to Menorah Island is a 15-minute boat ride, and the images, the first sort of year almost of work was really intensive, and it was very much based through photography and based through conversations with residents on the island. Menorah has an interesting history of inhabitation, and it possesses various historical and religious sites. So there's a Hindu temple, there's a sort of 19th century lighthouse. The British came to Menorah in 1832 and established a cantonment. So you have a lot of historical buildings on the island from that period. But it also had a population of about 14,000 residents. So, the history of the island is such that, many of the residents were given a golden handshake, and so Menorah sort of went through this process of urban decay because people left the island. They were going to rebuild it as a sort of holiday resort, which never happened because of the crash in 2008. So I really walked a lot on the island for the first year, and sort of felt that it was like a counterbalance to the chaos of the city of Karachi, with its 21 million people and its ethnic strife and violence, and I could actually physically walk, alone without feeling anxious or without being bothered about anybody. So I think that was one of the reasons I went to Menorah, to find this sort of space of reflection and find a space outside my studio which I could access. As an artist, I felt I was under the radar of the establishment. There was a large naval presence on the island, which has become more and more neurotic and paranoid about security, as all armed forces have in the country with terrorist attacks. So I felt that as an artist I could get under the radar most of the time, but my experiences with naval police were always interesting, and as a woman, again, I could get out of situations quite well. But really it was this process of mapping and trying to find ways of drawing something out of this space that I found really challenging, because the historical sort of historical and sort of this narratives out of the island were very interesting. Narratives of giant whales and fishermen, Sufi poetry, and out of this these narratives, I mean, I was constantly drawing out my own ideas and work and response. And so I'm just going to show you a few of those images of me responding to certain kinds of narratives, and responding in terms of proposals for installations which are quite grand and ambitious. I think in a sense I could have a whole exhibition which was just about the proposals and the ambitious sort of site-specific installations, which I think is great because it sort of talks about how we dream about these things, as artists, and the capacity to stretch the imagination. Again, drawing was a core activity over this time, and all of these images are all in response to conversations and understanding the space and the terrain. And I guess, I mean, I'm an image maker, so I kind of construct things in quite complex ways. And this is one of the images, which is called Floating Prisons, and it is a kind of direct response to the Indian fishermen that cross the waters into Pakistani waters, and then they're arrested, thrown into prison, and their boats are impounded. And so you find in the harbor this floating prison of small fishing boats, which are all tied up and rotting in the sea. So there's a lot of work which I've basically edited out, but just wanted to show you a few things. So again, I think what I felt overwhelmed by at this point was that the work was just going everywhere. I was drawing, there's a huge archive of photographs. I was thinking about these conceptual ideas, and then there were videos developing, and these objects in brass that I was casting narratives out of. So I was sort of in my studio thinking, what is going on here? How the hell am I going to talk about this work if I ever get a chance to? And I think, that process of just everything imploding didn't really stop. It hasn't stopped. But for the sake of the Menorah project, I started thinking about the idea of archives and about a lived archive, and I think that was my way of trying to think about these interdisciplinary sources of how things were accumulating. I was also thinking about all the unscripted links between these bubbles of work that were emerging, the watercolors and the drawings and the photographs. And I think I was also thinking about the differentials of knowledge, because through this time I was talking to urban scholars, historians, I was talking to my welder, I was talking to infringed communities, having dialogues with the establishment, the naval commodore. So, there were all these different sources of knowledge that were kind of, coming through into the work. And I think what I thought I would do was I would create a sense of an archive, which was a lived archive. Iftikhar knows about this, and he's given me a good critique on this, but anyway, I'm showing you the work which was shown in Shanghai at the Biennale, and it was basically a space where, a lot of these different aspects of my research or investigation or response to a particular locale were installed in a way that, the viewer could find certain kinds of links and narratives connecting. So I will just go through these images, some of the images, some of the photography, and just sort of show you these. So again, the idea of walking as an exploration of the city and the island, and it was also kind of an urban experience of learning and unlearning, because you have certain kinds of ideas about a space and about a city that you've lived in, and then when you actually walk through it and you experience it, it's the small things that kind of change and inform your ideas. So again, this is a small body of 4 images. I'm showing you 3 which were postcards from Manora. I kept thinking about how do you memorialize a space, the everydayness of a space, and the idea of a postcard or a snow globe that would represent a certain space. What would it be? Because when we go to a city, we pick up a snow globe or a postcard. And so these kinds of strategies of trying to construct things which could encapsulate, but constantly, shifting space, which is changing constantly. I now, I'm based in London, and the interesting thing is that Manora Island, for me, has become a kind of space of incubation. I'm sorry I haven't shown you everything that I've done in Manora, but I just talked about the kind of overwhelmingness of what had emerged and shown you a few images. But what's interesting now to look back on this work is that, again, that sense of, the modes of working that one has to create or has to find have really been something that I carry forward. And so this idea of incubation of ideas and about a certain way of working has been something that that particular body of work and that particular space had generated for me. And I feel that, many projects have germinated since in the last 3 years, which kind of find different guises in the different places that I'm working. Even though my location shifts, I feel that there's a critical relationship to this island, and also the nature of the ocean and its ecology. So just a few more images which lead up to a couple of stills of short films that I made during this time, one of which I'll share with you at the end of this conversation. This is a work in progress, which is also a filmic project. One of the things that I felt was that, like the island, which was almost like a sentry post, it had a lighthouse, it was a kind of a defense to the mainland of the city. The research has also become an observation point, which informs the projects that I'm undertaking. I think some of you saw this in the beginning, this piece, Near and Far Sights Converge, which was shot through a homemade telescope. And it's really looking at this sense of the ocean and people in the sea, with a sense of, moving with a sense of freedom. And this was shown in the inner city of Karachi. So it was shown in Golimar, which is a very, very dense urban space where people don't really get to see the ocean or to see the horizon. So it was interesting to have people come up to me and ask me, where is this place? Where is it? And I would say it's 20 minutes from the port. You take a boat and you sail out. So it was interesting to bring the ocean into the city and kind of create this sense of, also kind of understand the sense of the relationship between, the malleability of the city, the urban space, and how you can sort of shift these things and create those relationships. I'm going to show you a few minutes of the observatory video, which basically looks at weather reports from a 1939 India Weather Review document. And this is another still from a video. So, you know, these are some of the questions that emerged out of the work, which I suppose I carried with me into the works that I continued with. And one aspect of this time, which I haven't touched upon, are the large format oil paintings that I began around 2011. 10, please. And I'm just going to really visually let you sort of see these because you know, every painting has its own sort of inbuilt narrative, and it's difficult to deconstruct that in a few minutes. But these were large format oil paintings. Again, the act of walking the city became something very important to the scale of this work, but also to the way I was constructing these works. I guess they were kind of very personal responses to the city space. And these are some of the large works. These are small, but most of these are quite large. I would like to just briefly talk about the recent project which was shown at the Kochi Biennale. I'd like to acknowledge Professor Iftikhar Dadi's research of the city of Karachi, its urban space, its craft and urban culture, because I think that's something that I as an artist was sensing and encountering in the 90s, especially through his practice and the practice of Elizabeth Dadi. But it's interesting how, you know, I've come to something in which I'm also sort of in a roundabout way exploring urban craft culture in the sense that the journey through Manora has brought me here. But I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think, you know, I've taken hundreds of photographs and collected very inexpensive souvenirs, which are handmade boats covered in shells and sold in souvenir shops by the sea. And so this process of collecting objects and photographs has been really part of my long-term archival approach to Manora Island. The boats mark a kind of personal moment, but at the same time they're kind of an expression of collective memory. And over a period of time, I started noticing the changing aesthetics of these craft vessels that I was collecting. And this is what led me to this project, The Journey We Never Made. I started looking at the way that these objects were crafted in different places across Manora and the city. And working with different artisans, the actual work consists of a series of model vessels which were made by local artisans. And in place of the boats that they typically make, the sources of these new vessels were my personal archive of photographs taken in Karachi harbour over the last 10 years. I'd selected specific images of bulk carriers, fishing trawlers, as well as historical vessels that had, you know, marked the Indian Ocean at this point. And so these images were scaled down into line drawings and fabricated by the model and souvenir makers living in Karachi. So this is one example of how the images were carefully scaled down into line drawings, and then the result on the left is the boat fabricated by the model maker. And each craftsman really took their individual line drawing and kind of created and reinterpreted its form and its aesthetic. I tried not to intervene at all. I mean, it's difficult for me to say I didn't do anything. And I think that was part of the complexity of the project, you know, how much was I really in it and how much was I not. But I think, you know, working with two other artists as well as the artisans, you know, this was a constant kind of anxiety. I want to step out of this and I don't want to intervene. But I think the presence of a woman and the, you know, the whole kind of class structure in Pakistan the implications of all of that had its own fallout on how they responded to these ideas. So I was really working between different artisans, workshops, and again, much of my intervention was really to just give them the specific images of vessels, and the outcomes were really quite unscripted. This is another shot of process of the scaling down and the kind of idea of creating an object of intimacy, a souvenir almost that could be taken away. And I think also what I was interested in was this kind of sense of scale of global containers in relationship to really small fishing boats, and that kind of sense of how that talked about what's happening in Pakistan in terms of whether you have CPAC, or whether you have the NATO, or whether you have this whole idea of Karachi harbour being such a strategic port where all of these shifts of trade and commerce are kind of constantly taking place. So these are a few installation shots of the boats in Kochi. The original names of the boats were part of the vitrine that held the boats, so that viewers could identify with what was the name and what was the date of the boat. I think one of the things that I was interested in is how an object which is invested with multiple layers of production can also offer kind of divergent narratives on our relationship to history and the economies of production. So, each boat was handled by a different person, and it really had its own character, its own narrative, its own history, and that was really fascinating. So I'm putting everything in a tiny nutshell, but it was like 1 year of work, and kind of running between Manora and Kurangi industrial area and Shirin Jinnah colony, which, for those who are familiar with Karachi, are kind of quite diverse parts of the city. Anyway, out of this body of work, the thing that came out for me was also these drawings, coming back to drawing again, and looking at ideas of vessels, ideas of what they mean, thinking about sitting in London, thinking about Europe, looking at the refugee crisis on the sort of, not on the doorstep, but in and across sweeping Europe. The whole idea of the Mediterranean. And so a number of, there's been about a dozen drawings, but this is where the title of this talk comes from, Objects from the Deep. And it's quite an open-ended title. But these drawings sort of reflect on the sedimented nature of the objects, and also the kind of intimate pull between object, material, and nature, and how it fuses and erases the differences of place and identity. And it's sort of also, I think, a lot to do with the ocean and kind of the transformative force of the ocean. So these drawings continue, and some are very ambiguous and conceptual. Just the last 2 minutes, I will just show you images of works in progress in my studio. And these have been, again, the idea of the trigger, what sort of shifts what you're doing. So for the last 4 years, I've been going to Amsterdam to the Rijksmuseum. And every time I go and visit the museum, I go to the same room. I can't remember the number of the room, but it's the room with the porcelain, the broken porcelain, and the company paintings. Somebody knows it. And so, I don't know, I think also when you go back over and over again and you're looking at the same thing after 4 years, you're thinking, what's going on, get on with it, Naiza. So, over a period of time, I realized I was really basically fascinated by the fact that, a museum had first of all installed broken porcelain in their vitrines, and so beautifully installed. The cracked porcelain from the Ming Dynasty, which was found in a shipwreck in 1611. A Dutch company ship was traveling between China and Amsterdam. So these images come out of the sense of really again, the confluence, the idea of the kind of cosmopolitanism of the sea, and how objects move from one cultural space into another, how the Ming, sort of glue influenced the Delft blue and created another art form. And so this sort of sense of nature and objects kind of conspiring, which unfortunately man and politics cannot do. So, sort of really seeing all of that happening, and then all of the refugees coming, and the kind of, a sense of, barriers, and the sense of just things not working. So these images talk a little bit about just the visual impact of trying to deconstruct and reconstruct these bits of broken porcelain into certain narratives. And paintings in my studio right now, which also touch on research I'm doing with ideas of this particular painting, which is the company factory in Hooghly in Bengal, the Dutch headquarters in Hooghly, and looking at the way I can subvert ideas of a map, a space, a terrain, a colonial kind of structure, found, lost text, things which are kind of things I've been sitting with for a long time. So I'm just showing you these images of what's going on right now, which I shouldn't really, but it's nice to see if somebody has. I don't think I have time to talk about this, but this is a filmic project which looks at archives of weather history at particular moments in history. So I'm looking at archives of weather narratives, fictional, personal, historical, from 1947. And that's like one chapter of this film. But I'm looking at particular moments in history which are significant, and also looking at different cities, so it's sort of different geographies. This would be a filmic project shot in those locations, and if anyone has funding, please tell me. I can apply for some funding for this, because it's quite an ambitious project, and it's actually quite exciting, because again it kind of moves my work into a sort of another space of understanding geography and terrain in particular ways. I could just show 2 minutes of the video.
Yeah, I think, but how about you play the video and then maybe we can take questions over the video.
Okay,
so
sure.
If you play it in the background, so just so that, because people may have to leave and they may want to have questions and discussion.
Sure.
So please, go ahead and Naiza, if you want to just fill your own, kind of questions, or if people have comments or observations.
Jakhora, Jhansi, 31st January. Heavy hailstorm. 3 dead. Storm lasted 90 minutes. Many cattle and birds killed. Kanpur district. 1st March. Afternoon. Hailstorm. Damage to crops. Hundreds of birds killed. Amritsar, Hisar, Gurgaon, Laipur district. 5th March. Hailstorm. Crops of wheat, senji, shaftal and toria destroyed. Sodag, Chota Nagpur. 5th March. Hailstorm. 1 dead. 11 head of cattle and large number of birds killed. Dibrugarh, Assam, 12th March, evening, hailstorm. Several houses collapsed, trees uprooted, electric wires damaged. Sylhet, Assam, 17th March, evening, thundersquall. 1,000 square miles affected. Trains held up. Colombo, 29th March, night, thunderstorm. Several districts plunge in darkness. 400 telephones out of action. Mysore district, 6th March, thunderstorm. 1 dead. 2 huts burned down by lightning. 2 cars.
So I'll just let this run, but the narrative is Nimra Bocha, and she is narrating the classification of weather from the Storms and Cyclone weather review from 1939. And so this is like one of the things that sort of led me to question and think about weather narratives and weather archives, and you know, sort of one of the things that I was interested in kind of thinking about, you know, how we have inherited, you know, ideas of land and maritime history, but also we've inherited a history of weather, and how do you, you know, create a cartography of that across a lived experience of a particular moment. So this video is short. It's basically a kind of decapitated ruin in Manora Island, the observatory in Manora Island, and I found it, and I you know, wanted to talk about mapping this narrative of India before partition through the visuals of a space which were very specific, encapsulated. So it kind of opened up the terrain for me to think about places that, you know, we can't access anymore, and they can't access. So talk about Sylhet, or you know, Siliguri.
Places that are now in India or
Places which
Bangladesh.
are now in India.
So it's
Bangladesh.
divided up by borders.
But I was just very interested in the sense of the fact that I found the 1939 weather review in this building, and then that became, you know, the sort of, I was also really interested in the classification and the idea of how the British classified everything. And then also the absurdity of like 400 phones out of order and birds killed and 1 donkey died. You know, you think about these things now and you think, well, do you think Fox News would report if a donkey died in, you know, whatever, Oklahoma?
If you'd like to engage.